One, the market of food is extremely unequal with high ration prices, big farmers owning hectares of land and constantly removing the opportunity for small farmers actually achieving that same amount of wage prices or the crop prices that the big farmers are actually attaining it in the status quo. On our side of the house, the first thing that we would like to solve is why food security can be achieved massively. The second thing that we want to prove is why state can do it in a good manner. Since it's an actor plus a policy motion, the first thing that we would like to determine is what the policy looks like. What does this nationalization look like? Everything that is grown for food supply, such as plants, animals, cattle, food grains, everything, all the ration, etc., will be owned by the state. Note there is a difference between ownership and management, which means on our side of the house, even if things can be owned by the state, there can be day-to-day functioning which can be determined by the private players in and of itself. Because within the land, sure, you can have farmers really caring about the kind of crops they are growing, but oftentimes there can be private players who determine what's happening within the day-to-day functioning. But note, we are taking the fairest binary. We are saying the ownership still retains by the state altogether. The second is, it is in the current status quo, this is what's happening. It's oftentimes state mandis, but also massive private players who also have a lot of ownership. But the problem with this is, there's a huge amount of inequality within state, such as because of Green Revolution, Uttar Pradesh, or let's say Punjab, has had a lot of success, and they've had massive amount of crop management that most of these people within these bigger cities are literally having. Smaller states such as Odisha or Vidarbha region, such as smaller states of Maharashtra, etc., are really suffering because they oftentimes don't have a lot of crop farming, but they oftentimes lose out on the opportunity as well. What does this body of food management really looks like? This can be a body like a central food organization, such like an RBI. This can do a couple of functioning. The first function is most of the food production or the procurement of this food production can be determined by the body who really reports to state government altogether or the central government, etc. The second is the coordination and the procurement can be determined by the central government. This can also manage the pricing. This can also regulate the kind of pricing, etc. This can also determine an annual target and can determine what kind of food crops can be grown on what level, which means this also determines and maybe gives out reports, annual reports of, hey, this is what the demand of the country looks like. It's not just rice, it can be wheat, can be millet, can be a lot of things which probably the different states altogether determine significantly. The first thing, clarification that we want to make is, it's not about cash crops, it's only about the food crops that really determine this, which means things like jute, things like maybe sugarcane, things like textile, etc. are not within the ambit of the debate. That really determines what's going to happen within the debate altogether. The first problem that we want to identify is right now, most of the states really focus on having more rice production. The problem with rice production is it uses a lot of water, but the problem is you don't have a lot of water and it's a water intensive crop. So this is a problem. There are three problems with this. Oftentimes there are frequent crop failures because the land itself don't produce a lot of water, and oftentimes this reduces the ability for the farmers to really bring out that kind of crop altogether. This leads to farmer frustration and farmer suicide. The last thing is it really reduces the durability of how that farmer will actually procure that market price over a frequent time span altogether. On our side of the house, at least you can determine on a more fiscal period of what the demand really looks like. It's not just rice, it can be maybe wheat, millets and bajra, etc. that you can grow. This is much more, this is less intensive but also really possible to obtain on our side of the house to begin with. Before I go on and tell you why does the state do it in a good manner, yes, Vishesh?
The head of this corporation is likely to be governed by, appointed by the central government, yes or no?
There can be multiple things. There can be economists, there can be maybe like governors, or maybe like people who are good at farming, people who know what the fiscal policy would look like. There can be multiple things altogether. This is how even RBI has a good economic policy which is determined by good economists, etc. I don't think so. Like, sure, majority of the people can be government-wise, but they do understand what the nature of the food would look like. I mean, you do not want to starve the people who probably like really depend on the food policy. Why will the state do it in a good manner? The first is, most of the governments really care about the nutrition of their own citizens. This looks like your policies are directly determined on the kind of food production that you will levy within that state or the city altogether. Most of these things are dependent on the food policies, nutrition ability, or food itself determines the human development index of that specific country. So at all points of time, you really want to care about the kind of food that your citizens are really using. It's the proximate interest that most of the people really have. Poor people care about food, rich people care about food. It's an equal incentive that all the people regardless have. The second is, it really directly levies onto electoral incentive, which means if the government really doesn't care about the food security of, let's say, rural population or urban population for that matter, you would literally be voted out, because it's the first thing that people oftentimes care about in the status quo more than other policies, which means the direct policy that harms all the other things which probably become more secondary or ancillary in nature to begin with. The third thing is, this is how most of the Indian governments operate. You probably have a public distribution system. You have so much of data collection or data mapping. You know which person lives where, which means you have Aadhaar data collection. All of these things are literally within the capacity of the state to determine, which means state has a huge amount of power to determine what's happening where, which means you have a huge amount of data repository of this is where the person is possibly living, which means you can really track which rural population is really suffering and what kind of food grain that you would want to give them in the first place, which means there are a couple of ways in which you can really determine the accountability and transparency mechanism of the state altogether. The first is obviously elections, but you have to determine, in India you can still have free press and a counter press which can determine that the state is not doing enough for ensuring the food security of the country altogether. This might look like alternative media houses like Live Mint, etc. can call the government out for really having shitty food policies in the first place. The second is, oftentimes even social media can determine the government grievances, which means this is what the people are possibly feeling, and maybe in states like Bihar, Chhapra, etc. you don't have food, and so you can probably get called out on this as well. This also looks like with the rise of digital governance in India, such as Paytm, UPI or blockchain technology, you can still determine what's happening with the public distribution system. This is still possible. India is still developing to a certain extent. This also looks like in India, you still have public audits and right to information acts. This can really help you be more accountable, but also keeps a check on what the government is doing with the kind of food security or food supply that they're determining outside. This also helps you to, one, incur the kind of long-term capacity that you can build on infrastructure. Note, private players do not care about long-term farming infrastructure capacity. They might really care about metros, etc., but they don't care about farming or agriculture that much. They might just exploit the lowest of the farmers and they would gain that kind of marginal profit that they're looking for on their side of the house. But at least on our side of the house, at least the government cares about that local farmer who isn't getting a lot of money, because that's a direct incentive that we voted down to the next, which means even AAP, BJP, regardless of the government name that you have within the country, they will still care about the nutrition of the entire country. The next thing that we want to push is how will you determine food security. Note, food security really ensures that something is on the verge of development, and this really can give you three impacts. First is you know what to grow, when to grow, but also leads to better management. The third thing is in fiscal year you know what the demand would look like, hence you would get that supply.
Thanking Prime Minister, inviting Elu.
Hello, Vishesh going as hello. Couple of shout outs. First offline finals, very happy. First shout out which I want to give is to Did You See Depsock? Amazing Depsock, kids are doing well. Very cute first year kids, like very good, hardworking. Cool. Second on seniors, like Krishank, Robin, Lavanya, and specifically Ayush Bhaiya and Keshav Didi, they are amazing. You don't get enough recognition, they are amazing people. Lastly, to my teammates, amazing teammates, Navakanth and Abel, very supportive, very fun, and amazing cases. Also, I'll give shout out to my debating friends like Sneha. Yeah, cool. Starting my speech on a self-calm down of with side government is that they don't run their case on a charitable grounds, right? So the first thing which they say is that this food corporation organization would be fair in nature because of multiple things. The first thing which they don't say is that while comparatively all of those mechanisms of accountability does not apply in whatsoever comparative you want to run. So they are still susceptible to like public call out, they are still susceptible to pressure like media companies and things like that. But second which I want to note, which is there's something dodge in the BOI, is that the head of this corporation is always going to be set by the central government at all points of time. Meaning the management or the logistics or the operation within this organization or the way you control the supply chain of food would always be controlled by the central government and based on their incentive, meaning the all of the amount of like backlash and other kind of things from opposition party can be there in a tokenistic manner, but the practical implication of that never materializes as so far as you have true ownership over this corporation. But the second thing which I want to bring is that this is specifically about India. things such as human index ranking and things like that does not matter for our central government because we are beyond like 100 ranking in all of the indexes. This is not a strong accountability mechanisms against our central government. But note, Modi and specifically the central government in our current period of time has been like moving towards fascism through policies such as like discussions of broadcasting bill, through probably 90% of the news channel being directly funded by political parties and things like that. Meaning the reasons they gave on accountability are one, flimsy, but second, uncomparative. Moving on to our cases and what do we want to run? The thing which you want to run is that nationalization on all level, and on the second column also before I move on to the constructive case is that they have been very, very uncomparative on all of the things as they say, why that cannot happen without nationalization. And this is something which they don't prove, you can check your sheets. Moving on to the R case on constructives. There are four things which I want to specifically talk about within nationalization. The first thing which I want to talk about is procurement of these crops. Second thing which I want to talk about is transportation of these crops. Third thing which I want to talk about is processing of these crops. And fourth thing is on distribution of this food. And I think all four things would be better if these things are not nationalized. Specifically note that nationalization is something which we agree their characterization of, that whole ownership is with government at all points of time of procurement, protection, like everything which I have explained earlier. The comparative which you want to defend is, I want to be very clear with this, the comparative which you defend is fragmentation in the ownership of these particular crops and things like that. And this ownership could be, in most instances, would be with private players, would be with private corporations and things like that, or it could be also in the hands of state governments, things like that. It is a choice for farmers to opt on either side of the paradigm. The first step which I will then talk about is on procurement and how do you procure crops in their sort of paradigm and why this is bad in nature. Note the most higher agricultural economic sectors like states such as Haryana, Punjab, etc. Would be double jeopardized in the way like their only source of income is agriculture, and once they would be procured, like their crops would be procured, and the certainty of the revenue of this procurements of crop is not assured for the states because states can justify giving this revenue, these crops to other parts of the country where it is more necessary, and they can say that these were more necessary in nature, meaning the revenue does not collect unto there. But second thing which is problem within this is with regards to capacity issue in procuring the most efficient manner, or the way you pay the farmers, and this is I want to stress about, right? The amount which you pay to the farmers is on capacity issue with the state, because state has multiple things which they need to invest their money upon. Specifically giving like higher amounts of money to the farmers is out of their pocket and is something which they cannot do. Second, on best case scenario on MSPs and minimum support price and things like that. The preemptive response to this is first on relativism and corruption, which one delays the process in which this MSP even reaches to you, or second, if you don't reach, the way you probably claim these payments and things like that is something which takes away a lot of time. The second thing which we want to talk about is with regards to the call out or accountability against state from farmer has historically not been heard, or even if they were heard, they were delayed. The most intuitive example is farmer protest, which stayed for 1.5 years in India, which leading to only some bits and some parts of the deals which were told by the farmers being fulfilled, meaning there is no strong accountability within India in and of itself. What is the solution on procurement? The first solution which we have is on crop subsidization, which private players specifically gives to the farmer, meaning they improve the technology. They prove because they want to sell good qualitative crops to their consumers, so that they can retain their consumers in a better manner, so that they can provide crops to export of internationally and things like that, and higher revenues. For that they have to ensure quality at the first place, and for that they have to give better technology, better resources, and better things which farmers ask, meaning probably the internationally and things like that, and higher revenues. For that they have to ensure quality at the first place, and for that they have to give better technology, better resources, and better things which farmers ask, meaning probably the process of giving payment to the farmers is better, the process in which they procure crops is necessarily better. The second is that the immediate benefit which you get on our side is that less burdening on governments as a whole, meaning if they don't have a lot of things specifically in controlling food chains of India, they can give direct help to farmers through policies of giving direct help to farmers because they don't have a lot of things. The second thing which I want to talk about is with regards to transportation or the tenders which you will give in nationalization, and why they would be specifically biased towards purely capitalistic friends of central government, and why comparatively to protect that. Before I move on, Ishwar.
Vishesh's entire speech is a non-starter because he does not link any of his impacts back to their own model. In absence of a every single thing that is pushed out as a harm is symmetric in this debate.
No, they can check sheets. Cool. Moving on to the third claims on transportation, right? So on transportation, the tenders which they will be giving to their people are on the people who gives them political funding or funding in their election campaigning at all points of time, meaning it just goes to big Ambanis and things like that, And the implication not just going back to the Ambanis, the implication is being there lesser number of options for your tenders for the transportation of wheat, bajra, rice, etc. and of itself. This creates monopoly within this specific sector of transportation of wheats and things like that. What is the solution in our side? The solution is that you let things on market forces. This looks like a lot of private players because there is a very lucrative market and everybody requires food on their table. We have a lot of people who are there on a specific market who compete amongst each other. The second, there are specific private players for specific niche in and of itself. So you have rural people who operate on rural areas, urban areas, semi-urban areas and things like that. They operate on different diversity and they compete with each other. And on note, specifically weighing or vulnerable situation. They can say that on vulnerable situation, states can regulate it better. The problem is that we are still reserved stocks of food which exist in either side of the paradigm. But second, we have direct help for farmers because we have less burdening. I think Abel could cover the processing part and other parts in his speech. Proud to oppose.
I want to defeat the comparative first. The comparative they just ideally glorify is that we will have choice. If you are a farmer, you want to sell it to Adani, you can sell there. If you want to sell it to governments, you can sell there. Multiple reasons why this won't end up being the comparative on their side of the house. Because they never proved the capacity of state to actively go ahead and compete with private entities. This is what literally happens right now. The reason why state mandis exist, the reason why state mandis is the only place where farmers can go ahead and sell their crops, the reason why MSPs are given to all farmers and they are not given an option to sell it to Ambani and Adani even at a higher price. Because the reason for all of this is that when you allow entry of private players in agricultural market, you systematically crowd out state. How does this happen? Private players by their own concession has huge capacity, which means Ambani and Adani can do two things. Firstly, they can give out more loans to farmers at the time of sowing to make them indebted to them. This looks like giving them money for maybe, buying high quality seeds or fertilizers and tractor, etc. Yes, it sounds good in the short term. That's the problem. When Ambani and Adani does it, the moment you go ahead and sign a contract with them as a farmer, obviously you have to sign the contract because there's no other way by which you can getting money. So, which means because by their concession, state does not have infinite capacity. So, you sign these contracts, you get into these exploitative contracts, and now you can only sell this body to this one MNC which is going ahead and taking away all of your products. This means that now if state has to effectively compete and give people choice on their side, they have to increase the MSP even more and more and more to compete with Ambani's and Adani's price which they are giving to farmers. But also, they have to give massive loans and massive debts to these farmers in order to compete again with the MNCs which are existent on their side of the house. Insofar as they are unable to prove state's capacity to do so, they cannot prove effective competition between state and private. What they will now say is, but state is all powerful, they will make laws. Well then, that's what nationalization means. You make laws that only I will be the buyer, only I will be the decider on which crop to grow, and only I will be the decider on where this crop goes. This is what we stand for on our side of the house. When you give state complete control, state has maximum ability to work in farmers' welfare. On their side, state loses this ability, state deprioritizes agriculture, state tells people to go ahead and sell their crops only to Adani and Ambani. I really don't give a fuck about them. So this is comparative which they now have to defend on why monopolies of private players don't exist. A simple reason why monopolies will be created and there won't be competition even within the private sector. Because agriculture as an activity, as an industry is seen as extremely volatile. There are multiple reasons for this. One, it is seasonal in nature. Secondly, it is prone to natural disasters. Thirdly, it's heavily dependent on rainfall even in India because this is where the debate is happening. Which means there are multiple reasons why food crops might collapse and private players might not get money out of it. Which means small private players are not the thing on their side of the house. The only private players who enter this market are ones who are big MNCs who can go ahead and absorb these losses and who can go ahead and fight against these uncertainties in the first place. This leads to monopolization or at best oligopoly monopolization and cartelization of agricultural sector on their side of the house, which state is never able to compete. This is an irreversible harm because once you open the market for agriculture, you as a nation become indebted and dependent on these MNCs to work in a good way for your own food security. They concede that food is something that is basic for every individual, and that is why we want state to retain control over it, and we don't want the control of it lost to MNCs and private players. The second thing I want to then do is, if state retains control, why does it lead to good outcomes for everyone? There are multiple mechanisms to this. The first mechanism is on price setting. So just understand this. If all food which you grow as a farmer is belonging to the state or is owned by the state, then state is ultimate authority in deciding what something which I own has to be priced at. So state uniquely gets ability on our side of the house to price the rice, to price the wheat. On their side, the prices will go sky high because because state has to compete with private. This might be good for farmers in short term. I've already proven to you why this is unsustainable in long term, which means in long term state exits this industry, which means in long term what happens is monopolization and then lowering of the price, because MNCs also have to recover their cost which they undertook in the market in the first place. This is what obviously all private players do. When they enter a market, they engage in predatory pricing. They will sell you at extremely low cost and they will purchase at an extremely high cost to crowd out the competition, and that is why they get monopoly. So in short term, on our side, governments decide prices. What does this do? How does this price decided? Three ways. Firstly, on demand and supply of not only that one state, but also of the nation as a whole. Which means literally the problem which they identified, rice grains are rotting in cold storage areas run by government. The reason for this is that government cannot stop rice production because the prices are not beyond government's control. So when I can set the price that if you grow rice, I will pay you less. If you grow wheat or if you grow barley, I will pay you more. This acts a direct incentive for farmers to do that. And this answers Vishesh POI. Why can't you go ahead and do this anyways? Because you don't own, so you can't fix prices, which means you can't incentivize farmers to shift away. Yes.
All of their harms stems out of monopoly. Once you already given your analysis on saying that everybody wants to have on the hands of supply chain because everybody requires food, there are going to be multiple players who would compete in the
I want food. That does not mean I spend my hard-earned money on buying a farm, because farming is an extremely unlucrative thing, because it's seasonal in nature, it's vulnerable to shocks. They really don't provide incentive or investment, they just provide that everyone wants food. So the second way in which price will be decided is based on quality and ESG concerns. This means sustainable and organic farming methods are uniquely incentivized on our side of the house, because you can say if you grow wheat through organic farming, we will pay you 100 rupees. If you grow wheat by traditional farming, we will give you 50 rupees. This kind of direct differentiation in price setting has multiple benefits. One, it unlocks crop diversification, which is the first harm of India as a country, because we are not able to get the benefits of exporting food crops, because all we produce is just wheat and rice. When we are able to set higher prices for better cash flow for more other food crops, we diversify crops, and therefore we are able to get more money from food exports. But also secondly, this is better for environment, because now water level and soil level are not being degraded by only growing rice again and again and again. We are growing multiple other crops which subset each other, and therefore better for environment and long-term income for farmers also. Proud.
How does a monopoly form? It forms when people have lack of access to a certain area to go ahead and invest into that area to create a business. But secondly, it also forms when demand can only be controlled by a certain player. Recognize when you have more amounts of people that see that there is a lot of people that want potatoes and onions and things like that. When they recognize that the price of onions are rising, you probably have demand for cheaper onions. They can't do that on their side of the world because it takes shit tons of time for you to lobby to the government to change the tender or the contract of who is supplying these onions and charging shit tons of money for these onions in the first place. Recognize on our side of the world, if you realize that another company is providing me onions at cheaper prices, I can literally switch the next fucking day. They have to take the trade-off that the time taken for recourse is so high, and why that is justified on their side of the world market in terms of prices, in terms of quality of product and things like that, which they cannot claim because they have to defend state ownership within all of this. They tell you that it's going to be managed by the, it's going to be owned by the state, but we're going to be let it be managed by like private players. The implication of this is that the state allocates these tenders based on which private entity caters to that political party the most, which implies that if Reliance can give me more amounts of money, I am going to give Reliance this contract at any given point in time, which implies that they have to prove why even if Reliance gives you bad potatoes, why BJP will tell Reliance to not give you bad potatoes at all points in time if BJP is able to benefit largely out of it in and of itself. The comparative is that if Reliance is existingly giving you bad potatoes, you can probably opt into other kinds of like suppliers that give you potatoes at cheap quantities. They then tell you that you cannot cross-subsidize insofar there are big players that are crowding you out. I don't think you need to own 5,000 fields to establish a supply chain. Presumably, you can cross-subsidize the resources for one farmer or one field and ensure that that supply is safely and moderately done to a certain community, which implies that local supply chains and local vendors actually exist, which means they're willing to give it to you at good quality prices and things like that. Why is this likely to be true? Because the burden of this is not to prove that, say, suppliers need to have large amounts of investment in order to enter the agricultural department. Presumably, even smaller scale industries can exist, which can undercut the prices of Reliance and things like that. The implication is that active market forces can ensure that these kinds of companies are kept in check. Kept in check in three metrics. One is that you provide better quality prices. Second is that you provide better quality of produce and things like that. And thirdly and most importantly, that farmers are being catered to. Because recognize on our side of the world, farmers can choose to opt out of the bad kind of like pricing strategies that exist and probably alternatively opt into multiple other suppliers or vendors in the first place. On their side of the world, if farmers are inherently dissatisfied, they have to first lobby against the government and tell them that they're dissatisfied. That also implies that the government has to listen to them in the first place and ensure that the government actually caters to them. Why then is nationalization so necessarily bad? The last thing I tell you is that people are skeptical of investing into agriculture because it's uncertain. I don't know why that is true. Presumably there is higher technology that is available for agriculture, which implies that the extent to which it's becoming unpredictable can be reduced in the long run. Why is this so certain and constantly existing on their side for them to do that? The comparative is very simple on why nationalizing is necessarily bad. One is because there is a high pressure on the government to dedicate time and resources. What is this resources? Presumably you have to pay salaries. Second, you have to pay money on these contracts, which implies that, oh, you will be paid this much money to ensure that the supply happens in the best possible manner. The implication is that the government has a higher burden to spend a lot of these resources. But the implication of this is that the government has the capacity to say what they want. The implication of this motion is that at all points in time, where exactly is India's food supply system better off, regardless of the political party that is in power? Which drives me to my second impact on how you end up politicizing food supply, which is to say two reasons for this. One is that you have a capacity to screw over states that aren't really supporting your political ideologies and things like that, which implies that the BJP and the Centre can choose to fuck over states in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, insofar they probably opt violate their other ideological narratives and things like that. Which means states now have exclusively have a mechanism to go ahead and ensure more amounts of violence and bad shit in these particular states. But secondly, recognize states now have another tool to ensure more amounts of fighting or more amounts of political controversies and things like that. Which is to say, at a point in time, states can probably go ahead and control the way food supply works. They can use that to probably shield or divert attention from the actual bad shit that states go ahead and do at any point in time. All of this is further reduces the extent of accountability that states have with regards to political discourse in the public and things like that. But lastly and most importantly, presumably this greatly reduces the speed at which things change in the market. But before moving on further,
where is accountability more or government's ability to shirk responsibility more? When it is only controlling a part of the market and just tell people to fuck off to and sell to private players if they are not happy, or where they control everything, which means whenever a famine occurs, everyone blames government.
So guts check this. Where did the state need to spend more money? Do they have to spend more money when you just have to put in regulations and when you just have to supervise, or when you just have to probably fill in the loopholes or fill in the areas where private property hasn't probably invested in? Or does state have to spend vast amounts of money on their side of the world when you have to actively own and manage an entire national food supply system and things like that? The implication of it all is that at all points in time, states have a lesser burden government just has to do the simple job of ensuring that shit doesn't go alright, but at the same time you also have private players that do due diligence, which is to say in terms of like supply chain shocks and things like that, if private companies want to maintain their profits and things like that, they're going to ensure that there's a reserve set of supplies and things like that. The implication is that private players also have an incentive to ensure safety of produce and things like that. Very good. Thanking DLO, inviting government.
2, 1, start. They have only one valid response going from first speech itself, which is that listen, this will not happen nicely because corruption. The issue with that is simple, which is one, insofar as they don't deal with Kaushiki's analysis of why you're likely to be accountable, they can't go ahead and just say corruption as one word and win. I'll go ahead and seal this idea, but before I do that, what's the comparative here? Because the screw up that they do at Abel is that then they claim that listen, these companies are likely to do this due diligence. I'm unsure why, because insofar as they don't have incentives to actually do this due diligence, at the end of the profit incentives are higher, I'm unsure why you actually go ahead and put in these efforts and extra money to go ahead and do so. On a comparative, why is government accountability likely to be better than private to any way whatsoever? Because government accountability doesn't just work with regards to electoral incentives as such, they have structural accountability measures, which looks like you're more susceptible to RTIs, which you probably can't go ahead and file with regards to private players. You probably have more government audits with regards to food supplies existing, which don't exist on other aspects with regards to private players. Insofar as that exists, you're probably more susceptible to actually being held accountable on a comparative. Private players probably won't go ahead and have this degree of due diligence as such. I'm unsure of these particular aspects again. But then again, I think I'd like to deal with the extensions that exist at Abel's speech, which is one, on politicizing this food supply, which basically then looks like that you as the central government will now not give funds to, will now not go ahead and deal with Tamil Nadu nicely, you'll go ahead and screw them over. Why is this unlikely? Because their own analysis that individual states have niche crops that they go ahead and give out to, which basically means you as the central government probably don't have an incentive to screw absolutely any state over, because what you probably get from Tamil Nadu you probably won't get from somewhere else. But secondly, if the central government is the only body responsible for anything of that sort, any screw up, any drought that goes ahead and happens in Tamil Nadu is likely go ahead and point it out towards the center in and of in the first place. So you're more likely to go ahead and be held accountable on these lines. So their own analysis also goes ahead and bites them in the ass. But then again, note as to how, insofar as the other mechanism that they will go ahead and provide is that listen, you probably require prompt response or anything of that sort. I think private players are more likely to go ahead and run away with regards to any issue, any crisis on food absolutely ever existing. It's probably government who only has the incentive to actually go ahead and care because of them who are having these electoral incentives at large. But the last thing that I wish to go ahead and deal with, which is, listen, you'll probably go ahead and spend more money as such. There are two responses to this. One on mitigation. That's not true, because on model we go ahead and point out that you'll probably go ahead and give managerial and day-to-day operations to with regards to contracts anyway. So what is the extent of the money that you're spending is something that they never prove. But B, what are you doing after saving this money on food crops anyway, something that they don't justify? Because the end impact that we are claiming is food security, which literally goes and saves lives of saves hungry people to a very large extent. That's one, which is the most important impact that can be claimed. But two, we already prove as to how farmer suicides are probably lesser on a particular paradigm and seal that impact as well. Which basically means I'm unsure of what you're doing by virtue of saving this money regardless. So then, I'd like to deal with two things as of this particular point in this speech. That's one on monopoly and second on the idea of food security as such. On monopoly, insofar as we go ahead and prove to you that big MNCs and all of these particular people are likely to be going ahead and exploitative anyway, the biggest manner in which they go ahead and exploit is by virtue of multiple competitions existing. Because insofar as competitions exist, you are likely to go ahead and hoard these grains. Why is hoarding the biggest harm that exists at opposition at all points of the time? Because insofar as you go ahead and hoard these particular grains, you as private corporations, because of your capacity, have an advantage to go ahead and govern supply, which literally goes ahead and governs prices of these particular things. This is the reason why Abel's analysis of 2021 onion price rising actually happened, because onions were largely gone ahead and hoarded by these private players. Insofar as that is true, this is what increases to price rises. This is what leads to the larger degree of the food scarcity that exists in India and food security never unlocking on their particular paradigm ever. Why is this particularly important? Because you as an individual farmer are never able to switch away because these particular individuals hoard it. So they buy on in favorable terms at one particular point of time, but they hoard it, they never sell it, and they sell it with regards to whenever the supply is gone ahead and beneficial for them. But then secondly, the alternative that they provide is that smaller scale farmers probably exist and they will provide you better quality pricing. I don't think so, primarily because the issue is that the actor that you're dealing with is India. Insofar as that is true, there's a huge amount of food that you require to accrue this food security, which you're never able to do if you have private players going ahead and doing so, because they don't have these incentives to go ahead and deal with this. Government is the only actor with both the incentive and the capacity. They have to not just go ahead and contest this on capacity, they have to deal with both these particular aspects to go ahead and win this debate at all points of times. But then again, before I deal with and seal the idea of food supply and why this is the most important thing and why we win this debate on this VOI, sure.
You can vote, but is it easier for the government to regulate and tell you not to vote, or somehow control the entire system altogether?
It is actually surprisingly easier to go ahead and control the entire system together, because I'll tell you what happens. Government goes ahead and tells private players, listen, don't hoard, it's illegal. Private players say, fuck you, I will. And that's literally what happens always. Hoarding has always been illegal. It has still always been happening. If their claim is that you can just tell them, then why has it not happened yet? It doesn't, because private players don't listen to you, and that's the issue as such. It is easier for you to go ahead and control by virtue of you actually having this particular capacity, because guess what? You're not that weak a government regardless of these particular claims going ahead and making. They had to seal this impact at first. They've never dealt with that particular framing as such on this. But then again, I'd like to deal with this particular idea with regards to food supply and why is it better to go ahead and be consistent. Because insofar as hoarding exists, this food supply, even if that exists on this particular paradigm, will never be consistent in nature, which means you never achieve food security truly on that particular paradigm. This consistency is always required for this food supply to actually go ahead and accrue on that particular paradigm. But in second, and what's more important on this case, is that insofar as government goes ahead and has this control over this particular aspect, governments can go ahead and tell you what to grow and what exactly is probably better off on this particular paradigm. On comparative, private players only have a profit incentive. This is what leads to private players saying, I will only buy basmati at higher margins. So I don't care if you're in the Vidarbha region that's dry as fuck, you'll probably still have to go ahead and grow rice regardless, because private players are only buying that particular basmati rice on these particular points of time. And then the diversification of crops is only possible at Gulf, because governments can go ahead and still buy this, and it's climate resilient in this particular cases. Even though climate resilient does not sound intuitive, why is this particularly important? Because insofar as you are a farmer living in the dry regions of Uttar Pradesh, in the Vidarbha region of Maharashtra, you're largely pushed by these private players to go ahead and grow basmati. Insofar as you go ahead and do so, you don't get the water, your crop fails, and this is what leads to massive amount of suicides within these particular regions. You never are able to pivot away to other particular crops, such as millets, such as maize, which probably use less amount of water. So this is not just harmful with regards to climate, it also is the leading cause of massive degrees of farmer suicides, which is the biggest harm that can exist to a very large extent. Insofar as none of this is solved, this is the only mechanism and where you only are better off on greater utility at Gov. Vote for food security, vote Gov.
Hanging government whip, inviting opposition.
3, 2, 1. The concession that government takes is that, oh, we are just going to own this to the point where you're going to sell it to like private players. If the end impact said you're going to sell it to private players, then all the arms of hoarding, all the arms of private players exploiting will still happen on their side, because you buy it from state and now you probably go ahead and hoard. Because if their premise is that state is inefficient in regulating the amount of hoarding that they do, then that still happens on their side. The problem is that they give multiple like very good analysis on why private players are very big players and they will always go ahead and like buy things. Then they can still go ahead and buy most of the food grains on their side as well, but they just buy it from state. That still happens on their side, which means that that government has been uncompetitive throughout this debate. 3 clashes in this debate. First, on accountability. Second, on food security, and third, on politicization. I want to say on accountability. They say that, oh, people can hold states accountable. The problem is that you can hold states accountable only once in 5 years, but you can hold the private players accountable the next minute. Because if they're probably going ahead and exploiting, then they can choose. Because on their side, where farmers do not necessarily have a choice, they are forced to go ahead and sell all their produce to like government. But also, farmers also do not have a choice to sell it in the first place, because state can just say, oh, we have bought the necessary potato that we need, now we won't buy enough, which means that the farmers who get knocked out, we do not have any other sellers on our side. Why is this necessarily true? We tell you now from our first speech itself that state has limited capacity, which means they can't buy all the produce that is being produced, which means that you buy only a certain amount of things which you can go and do, because the amount of capacity for you to have cold storages, the amount of capacity for you to go ahead and store these food produce is still limited. The amount of money that you have to go ahead and give to farmers is still limited, which means there will always be farmers who will get locked out on their side, who have produce but they can't sell it. What is very harmful? What is the worst thing that can happen to a farmer? It is not buy, so at least people get food on our side, and at least farmers are able to sell their produce. They can't even sell, and they do not have like any regular prices. For all those reasons,
with this, we will be concluding the constructive speeches here.
Of 3, 2, and 1. If they tell you that monopoly is something that happens on our side of the world, they also have to prove why this monopoly does not necessarily have the capacity to buy out the state. In the sense that it's probably easy for a company like Reliance to probably get the tender to supply rice to the vast majority of India and effectively crowding out a lot of other individual suppliers in essence. The implication is that monopolies have the capacity to be equally damaging on both sides of the world. What we then tell you is that it's much more easier for monopolies to probably not exist on our side of the world because they don't have the capacity to probably crowd out a vast majority of players by having one tender with the government easily. But at the end of the day, we think that monopolies is something that has, it has greater capacity to not exist on our side. The second thing that I tell you is that private players simply don't need to listen to the government. I don't know why this is true in all instances, because presumably you have, governments have the capacity to literally make or break an entire company. I don't know why exactly all instances of companies don't really want to listen to the government anyways. But the end thing on accountability is very simple. We'd much rather have companies that are accountable to people as opposed to companies being accountable to the government, because presumably governments and their incentives can change every 5 years, which may or may not be aligned with what the people want at the end of the day, which implies that insofar you have companies that listen to market demand, at all points in time we can ensure that people are catered to at all points in time. They have to defend a world where the government has the incentive to cater to all people at any given point in time, regardless of the kind of political differences. Because that's the problem. They tell you that, the center does not have an incentive to fuck over the states. I don't know why this is true. Presumably, if BJP wants to get more access into Kerala, the way to do it is by creating vast amounts of discomfort within the people of Kerala and telling them that, hey, your chief minister is bad and this is why this is happening to you. Which means the capacity for you to create narratives within these states become a lot more powerful insofar you're able to control the supply of food, which they concede is very important for a state to flourish. Which means the capacity for the center to polarize people and to create vast amount of political discomfort is significantly more higher. That reduces the kind of accountability that the government has at any given point in time. What government tells you in terms of what is supposedly exclusive benefits is threefold. One is that they tell you have targeted policies, which implies that, you can ensure that some farmers produce some things. I don't know why you can't do that on a market level, which implies that insofar these segments and niches exist, you have the capacity to go ahead and ensure that sufficient demand is catered to anyways. But the last call out on what they have to say in their POI is that, if there is competitive nature, then there is no incentive or capacity for you to ensure better pricing. The first step of profit making is ensuring that you have a demand and ensuring that you cater to the kind of demands of people. Which means you have an active incentive to ensure that you reduce prices, to ensure more amounts of accessibility, because that's where you get fucking revenue in the first place. Which means companies have an active incentive to ensure this kind of accessibility, because that's the starting point of you even surviving in the market in the first place. We tell you that ideas such as better pricing, targeted policies, and subsidizing farmers is something that's inexclusive and symmetric at max. The reason we win this debate is because we give you pragmatic harms of going ahead and nationalizing these. Which is to say, ideas where states have vast amounts of power to shape public narrative because they control food supply is significantly and exclusively harmful only on their side of the world, wherein states have significantly large amounts of power. But secondly, on our side of the world, instead of states don't have to put in shit tons of resources into this project, you can presumably have more resources to work on affirmative action. Which is to say, presumably when there are inevitable kind of loopholes or lack of reach within these private areas or private investment, at all points in time, state now has the capacity exclusively on our side to cater to these niche areas that these private players don't want to invest in. Which on our side of the world, you have an active capacity and an incentive to go ahead and do this at all points in time. If they tell you that capacity does not exist at all points in time, we can also tell you the investment does not exist. I don't think that can ever be the debate.
Their response is regulation. Like I told you, if state is good, so if state is bad, because this is what their push is towards us, why will they regulate in good ways? Which means if state is bad, then they can probably have bad regulations in Kerala and good regulations in Haryana. If state is bad, then they can probably have political and food security harms on either side of the house. If state is getting election funding from Ambani, because that is their push towards us, then you will sell all your food to Ambani and there will be a state monopoly. State can probably not go ahead and stop Ambani from exploiting farmers on their side as well. Which means if state is bad, none of your impacts are viable, because state will just then don't regulate. But if state is good, why then we are winning? If state is good, then your capacity to regulate, their best case is state regulation exists and private players own and control and manage this. On the comparative, state is good and state directly owns, controls and manages this. The exclusive benefits lie here. Even if private players exist and they are being controlled by state, why is that situation as a whole bad? Because one, I have already proven to you why private players inherently have bad incentives, because there are not many private players, so monopoly will exist because there is entry of barrier to agriculture. But let's just say you don't buy this. Let's say that there is competition, which is the best case. What happens in competition? We just assume competition equal to good. It's not always good, because what happens in competition is that they basically want companies to give a good price to farmers, because competition, so price to farmers will obviously be high. But at the same time, don't expect profits from it and sell it at a subsidized price to buyers and consumers. Because either or can be true. If company is buying at 100 rupees per kilo because of competition, because other people are also buying at 100, then they have to necessarily sell it at 150 to the consumers, because they have profit motive. This is where we uniquely differentiate. State does not have profit incentive, which means state is the only actor in this player who can buy at a good price but also sell at a cheaper price. So we are the only capable actor in this particular debate who can benefit both buyers and consumers. They have to take this trade-off. Either buyers will be benefited because of competition or consumers will be benefited because of competition. They can't benefit. So, but the third thing then, on why private control won't happen. So, this proves that even if competition exists between private players, that's bad. Let's say monopoly exists. But monopolies are good because they bring in capacity, they will modernize our agriculture stuff like that. And this is the biggest case of straw manning I have seen. We never said right from PM that you will buy everything and then sell it to Abani. We are not selling. That's not how tenders work. I think it's AIV based on India. Tenders mean you are not giving up ownership. You are inviting tenders for management purposes. So you will invite private players to go ahead and manage the distribution of the crops. You won't go ahead and sell the crops to fucking private Reliance and Adani and Ambani and allow them to exploit people anyway. So we are not selling to monopoly, we are still retaining ownership of food. We are just hiring private contractors to manage the supply. This co-ops all the benefits of modernization, capacity building, etc., because different companies compete with each other to get this government tender. Which means that if governments are good, because that is when their regulation impacts unlock, then we have much better control over regulation, because we can regulate that if Adani wants this contract, they have to necessarily produce organically cultivated food. If Ambani wants this contract, they necessarily have to go ahead and produce more cheaper goods and stuff like that. Which means we have more control over private players simply by owning this particular food. They don't own this, it is control falters. But last thing on accountability. We gave you multiple incentives on why states are comparatively more accountable than private players. What is their mechanism of accountability? How does a farmer fight with Ambani and Adani? They can't. They say you opt out and you go to someone else. Problem is that someone else is in some other locality, in some other state. They never prove why there is competition at all levels, why this competition is accessible, why this choice is accessible. On our side of the house, uniquely, we go ahead and prove multiple ways of accountability, RTI, media houses, opposition parties. None of this is co-op.